Thank you to everyone who responded to our first video. Welcome to the Unobstructed Way on YouTube, an 11-video presentation about the unobstructed universe teachings of Betty and Stewart Edward White. The first 3 videos, this is the second, will explore their exotic lives and legacies. Betty channeled the material, Stewart wrote it down. The next 6 videos will give us a deeper understanding of the teachings of the Invisibles, who were concerned that the usual description of entities such as themselves as spirits would bring with it assumptions and visualizations that could obstruct understanding. Here, we'll look at the timeline of their books in chronological order, followed by a deeper dive into the ideas and exercises given in each. The final 2 videos compare the teachings of the Invisibles to traditions far away from each other in time and place, but much like each other in content. We'll see how Plato's teachings about the afterlife closely resemble the teachings of the Invisibles. In the final video, we explore the remarkable similarities between the unobstructed universe teachings and the Taoist alchemical text, The Secret of the Golden Flower, written down in 17th century China. We begin now with part 2. A true story of love beyond death. Quote, Stewart E. White, novelist, is dead. Author of stories of adventure and frontier life, was 73. Stricken after fabled career. Choked leopard to death. Writer of Blazed Trail. New Yukon, Africa, and West. Honored as geographer, end quote. New York Times Obituary, 1946. Stewart Edward White was born March 12, 1873, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, when it was a town of 30,000. Grand Rapids suffered less than most of America during the financial panic of 1873 and the 4-year depression that followed. Stewart's father, Tom White Jr., was a great American dad. Stewart later wrote of his admiration for his father's, quote, energy, vitality, honesty, good judgment, and virility, end quote. Judging from the heroes of Stewart's earlier novels, without Tom's parenting, Stewart may have been a bookish, indoors fellow. Tom was a shrewd father. First, he introduced his son to bird watching, which easily led to camping, then hunting. Stewart's grandfather, Tom's own father, was also a resourceful man. Captain Tom White Sr. had been born in Ashfield, Massachusetts in 1805. As Tom Sr. approached his 30th birthday, he married. The newlyweds trekked west to Detroit. From there, they hiked native trails and then rafted to the Grand River, where they helped settle the town of Grand Haven. Tom Sr. took on a series of jobs, from captaining a riverboat to building bridges. Then in 1865, Tom Sr. bought a business supply known as Stevens Sawmill. Buying forest acreage and selling lumber during the decade when Michigan became America's greatest lumber-producing state, he became a millionaire. Tom Jr. was his father's man on the ground for a business that sprawled over mountain ranges. Stewart and his brothers grew up in the woods, on rivers, in sawmills and lumber camps. When his father died in 1884, Tom Jr. brought his wife and 5 sons to Santa Barbara to winter at the legendary Arlington Hotel. Stewart learned to ride horses. He kept a journal as he experienced the romance of the quickly fading ranchero culture. He later wrote books of fiction and nonfiction about the twilight of the vaqueros, the Spanish ranchers who had once ruled the state. Tom Jr. could see Michigan wasn't going to support an ever-expanding lumber industry, so he began buying acres of California forest, then moved west with his family. For most of his childhood, instead of a teacher, Stewart had a private tutor. When he was 16, the family returned to Grand Rapids and settled down long enough for him to go to school. At 18, he graduated president of his class. Along the way, he set the record for fastest 5-mile run at the school. Tom may have been surprised when high school track and field hero Stewart began skinning and preserving specimens of birds. Perhaps even more so when the budding young writer published over 30 articles in scientific and bird-watching publications, including a pamphlet on the birds of Mackinac Island, published by the Ornithologists Union. Today, we might be horrified by Stewart's collection of nearly 700 bird skins, but the Kent Scientific Museum of Grand Rapids was delighted to have the collection bequeathed to them. As the story continues, we will see how safari hunter Stewart learned to appreciate animals in less harmful ways, thanks to his wife, Betty. Like so many parents of writers, most of whom are proven correct, Tom Jr. didn't think Stewart could make a living as a writer. He must have been disappointed with Stewart's Bachelor of Philosophy degree from the University of Michigan in 1895, but at least Stewart graduated Phi Beta Kappa. While in college, Stewart spent his summer vacations sailing on the Great Lakes in a 28-foot cutter sloop. After graduation, he spent 6 months working in a meat packing house at $6 a week. Was Stewart trying to prove to his father how tough he was? Was this Tom's idea of teaching Stewart about the hard realities of earning money? Or did his taxidermy lead Stewart to an interest in the practical art of butchery? Next, Stewart went to work in his family business in the accounting office. After giving Stewart a good taste of life behind the desk, Tom sent him on a mission. The family had invested in a gold mine in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Stewart was sent to look around and make sure the family wasn't getting cheated. Stewart found a lawless frontier where his family was not only getting cheated, they were getting robbed blind. Stewart had to face down a lynch mob when the criminals told the miners that he was holding up their paychecks. He kept cool and avoided trouble. Local law enforcement did the rest. Tom Jr. must have been pleased when Stewart went back to school. Only a year had passed, but his son had learned some valuable lessons about life, work, and people. Stewart was now studying law at Columbia University. Unfortunately for Dad, his first year there, Stewart took an English composition class, and the short story he wrote was so good, the professor convinced him to submit it to a magazine. Stewart got paid $15. Stewart's first book, The Westerner, was published in 1901. He was 28 years old. His early novels were awkward, relied too much on coincidence, with female characters only lightly sketched and villains grandiose yet vague. He showed great promise, most reviewers agreed. A few complained of grim cruelty in the lengthy descriptions of murdered characters who did not have to die to serve the plot. Perhaps to appease his father, Stewart returned to the University of Michigan to get a master's degree. To support himself, he took a job at McClurg's bookstore in Chicago at $9 a week. That only made him lonesome for the wilderness he grew up in, so he set out for Hudson Bay. Then his third book was published. The Claim Jumpers was based on his real-life Black Hills gold rush experiences. For the serial rights, Stewart was paid 100 $5 bills, which upon receiving, he quickly stuffed in his pockets, leaving immediately for fear that some mistake had been made. In 1902, Stewart sent a copy of his book to the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, and received a return letter. It seems, upon a friend's recommendation, Roosevelt had already got a copy and was enjoying it. He told Stewart to look him up next time he was in Washington, D.C. Stewart set to work on what would become his most famous novel, but not his most famous book. The Blazed Trail was written in a lumber camp, in the freezing cold of a northern winter. He wrote from 4 a.m. until 8 a.m. every morning, then put on his snowshoes and did a day's work as a lumberjack. From manual labor to labors of love. 3 years after the beginning of the 20th century, blues legend Mississippi John Hurt began plucking his guitar for appreciative audiences. Also in 1903, opera star Enrico Caruso recorded his first 78s for RCA. Influenced by the writings of Nietzsche and the culture of ancient Greece, Isadora Duncan created free dance. You can get a feeling for how quickly the world was going to change by looking at the names of several of the historical figures born that year: Anais Nin, John Dillinger, George Orwell, and Bob Hope. 1903 was a wonderful year for Stewart Edward White. He received his master's degree from University of Michigan. The Blazed Trail became a bestseller. Stewart visited his parents, who had retired to Santa Barbara. Theodore Roosevelt, passing through and hearing Stewart was in town, asked him to join his train journey north. They talked all the way to San Luis Obispo, where Stewart disembarked. Teddy and Stewart became good friends. With the help of Pulitzer Prize-winning fellow writer and paranormal explorer Hamlin Garland, and mutual friend General Ethan Allen Hitchcock, anonymous author of a book on alchemy, Stewart helped bring out the conservationist in Roosevelt, while moderating as much as they could his notorious disrespect for indigenous Americans. Garland's work, renaming the Sioux tribe, which did help them regain some of their property, led to his commission of nothing less than a cultural crime when he Americanized ancestral names as if they were mere characters in one of his books. But in 1903, Stewart met someone much more important to him than the 26th President of the United States. He met Elizabeth Grant, the love of his life. It took him a year to convince her very wealthy parents that a rough fellow from the frontier like him, and a book writer to boot, should be allowed to marry their carefully cultivated upper-class gem. They wed on Thursday, April 28th, in the year 1904, at Trinity Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Her parents must have been dismayed when the newlyweds announced they were off to a honeymoon hike in the wilderness of California for 4 months. But Betty loved her new lifestyle and flourished. In 1905, Mr. and Mrs. White moved to Santa Barbara, and Santa Barbara would never be the same. On their safari to equatorial East Africa, while Stewart was still collecting trophy pelts, Betty used her rifle to shoot down seed pods from the African fern pine, later planted in Santa Barbara's Alameda Plaza. Wherever they traveled, she gathered rare seeds, bulbs, and plants for Dr. Franceschi, the famed Italian horticulturist, who opened a plant nursery in Santa Barbara. Franceschi introduced nearly 900 new species to Southern California. His house and gardens are now a park. One of the first white men in Tanzania, Stewart mapped it in 1913, which earned him election as a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. With a friend, the Whites bought property in Sandyland Cove, just south of Santa Barbara, which Stewart claimed to have named. They built a beach cottage on one of the lots. Stewart canoed and surfed in the Pacific under the California sun. Meanwhile, his novel, Ashes of Three, was made into a movie at Santa Barbara's Flying A Studios. In 1914, the Whites hosted a benefit food drive for Belgian victims of World War I. Stewart and his friends recruited Santa Barbara locals for a military unit called the Grizzlies. Quote, "In a few weeks," Stewart wrote, "with the enthusiastic aid of many old friends, we had actually signed up a whole battalion, a large proportion of whom were hard-bitten cowboys, rangers, out-of-door old-timers," end quote. They had their own song called the California Grizzlies that included the lines, "We're fighting for democracy. Human rights our battle cry. And when Old Glory leads us, we'll conquer or we'll die." Stewart and Betty's home became so popular with vacationing friends in 1916, the Whites decided to leave Santa Barbara for the high society of San Francisco. Quote, "Since we possess neither a banquet hall nor a sightseeing bus," Stewart wrote, "nor 36 idle hours a day, we moved to Hillsborough," end quote. Today, Betty's gardens at their estate in Hillsborough are disheveled, and while still beautiful, somewhat commonplace, though the old rose bushes, thick with large blooms, hint at former glories. One can easily imagine the footsteps of the Whites echoing up the majestic wooden stairs and in the large rooms of rich dark paneling. The architecture, while elegant, gives the buildings the fanciful look of enchanted cottages. The interior of the Ark, where Stewart kept his hunting trophies, is now a huge sitting room with a billiard table dwarfed by the magnificent beamed ceiling, which does resemble an inverted Noah's Ark. When Stewart moved to Hillsborough, was he trying to put his beloved wife in the hands of the elite she had grown up with? He must have known America could only delay so long before entering the war. From 1917 to 1918, Stewart joined his Grizzlies, fighting in World War I. He was a major in the 144th Field Artillery. A fateful encounter with a Ouija board. At a memorial gathering for Theodore Roosevelt in 1919, White was on the platform and was introduced as the, quote, "author, soldier, and hunter who was one of the Roosevelt party on his big game hunt through Africa," end quote. Losing the friend who taught him to enthusiastically exclaim, "Bully!" such a virile human as Teddy, must have turned Stewart's thoughts to the mystery of death. Until 1919, he later wrote, quote, "I had paid occult matters little attention. I knew that spiritualism had been exposed," end quote. He was a successful writer, a world traveler, in love, and wealthy in the new world that was California. A big game hunter, yacht club favorite, a man of thought and action. What little he knew about spirits was that all such nonsense had been proven fake years ago. On the other hand, he, quote, "had some experience with such phenomenon as the swift transmission of news by indigenous people across wide wastes of sparsely inhabited country," end quote. In 2 months, all his preconceptions would be blown away. As we have seen on March 17th at a dinner party, the Ouija board incident occurred that changed so many lives. This was no ordinary seance of alleged dead acquaintances communicating familiar messages. This wasn't Kardec's The Spirits book with its questions and answers about life after death, reincarnation, and the operation of the law of karma. This was no Edgar Cayce reading of home remedies and past lives in Atlantis. The Invisibles were proposing a great experiment. They would teach Betty to be a different kind of medium, a highly refined instrument. In the book Across the Unknown, Stewart would later write, quote, "Frankly, I could not for a long time accept them for what they purported to be. But driven is the word. I was finally driven to it. It took a long time and a gradual accumulation of small logicalities rather than large evidences, though these did not lack. Finally, I could not reject them, simply because rejection at last became ridiculous." End quote. Elsewhere in the same book, he wrote, quote, "My whole training was against me. I was as yet interested only in definite, clear-cut ideas. All my experience up to now seemed to have proved them the most reliable guides. At any rate, they were least likely to conduct one into dangerous fogs. I rather prided myself on being practical and hard-headed and, quote, intellectual, unquote. What I wanted was direct statements, ideas, scientific facts," end quote. Automatic writing started out very slowly. Words might take an hour to form, one slow movement at a time. Betty found it easier when she was blindfolded with her head turned away from pencil and paper. Eventually, communication became more fluid, pouring out complex and articulate messages in an unbroken flow. Then, after a few months, the Invisibles made the formal announcement that the automatic writing would stop. The Whites were disappointed. The experiment had been such a success. That was when, on a business trip, Stewart ran into a copy of the book Our Unseen Guest, a bestseller in the immediate aftermath of World War I. The anonymous authors who called themselves Joan and Darby also began their adventure with a Ouija board and automatic writing, but they went on to mediumship. A spirit calling himself Stephen, claiming to have died in the war, gave a remarkably coherent philosophy of life and death. Darby and Joan, a cliché phrase for a happily married couple, were Emmett and Ruth Ebright Finley. Emmett was a reporter, editor, and later an executive at several newspaper printing and supply companies. At the Cleveland Times newspaper, Ruth was known for her stories about working women. She helped get a bill passed to support them. Ruth was also a successful editor of magazines, an author, historian, and feminist. One of her best-known books was Old Patchwork Quilts and the Women Who Made Them. Inspired by Our Unseen Guest, Betty became a voice medium, with the same initial struggles and slow progress followed by uninterrupted flow. Stewart took notes in shorthand. Tape recorders were still a few years away. He reported the curious phenomenon of blindfolded Betty in trance correcting him when he miswrote a word that she could not possibly see. For example, when he wrote attitude of soul instead of altitude of soul. In 1921, Stewart's book Conjurer's House was made into the movie The Call of the North, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. A year later, he and Betty boarded their boat. To a friend, Stewart wrote, 15 tons, 50 feet, sleeps 5, 37 horsepower, heavy-duty engine, built seagoing, speed 9 knots, no phonograph, no wine cellar. We are going north. That is all the plans we have. We too are all there are on board, though we are thinking of getting a cat. The boat's name is the Reckless. Be careful how you spell it. It was spelled Wreckles. By 1923, Stewart was a research officer for the American Society of Psychical Research. His book, Credo, published in 1925, was his first publication of the channeled material, though he didn't reveal the source. The folksier, more accessible Why Be a Mud Turtle followed in 1928. The philosophy of life in these books struck a chord with so many readers, the Whites were encouraged to continue their experiments. In these experiments, they were sometimes joined by Joan and Darby and by Margaret Cameron, whose channeled book, The Seven Purposes, had been published in 1918. The Seven Purposes correctly warned a world deluded with the hope of war having ended forever, that even darker times were coming. That was the stated purpose of Cameron's channeling, to help more people understand death, because so many would die soon in a battle that would decide the fate of humanity. World War I was followed by World War II. In May 1927, the Boy Scouts of America designated a new distinction, the title of Honorary Scout for, quote, American citizens whose achievements in outdoor activity, exploration, and worthwhile adventure are of such an exceptional character as to capture the imagination of boys, end quote. 18 men were found worthy of the first list, including aviation pioneer Orville Wright and Stewart Edward White. The Depression of 1929 did not impact the Whites. Stewart published a book in 1930 and two in 1932. That year, President Hoover proclaimed him one of his favorite American novelists. Stewart's 1919 novel, The Killer, was made into a film called Mystery Ranch. But in secret, Stewart and Betty were enthusiastically exploring her newfound ability. The channeled messages, Stewart now understood, revealed an organization and forethought he admitted the subconscious might be capable of, but then how to explain the, quote, attitude and altitude incident, end quote, and so many like it. The Betty books. So here is a brief outline of the Betty books you can refer to for the timeline of events in the following videos. The experiments began in 1919. 1925, Credo. 1928, Why Be a Mud Turtle. The first two books kept things casual. In Credo, Stewart focused on the philosophy of the invisibles. He admitted they were the product of mediumship, but didn't reveal who that medium might be. He explained why they made sense to him. Why Be a Mud Turtle was more conversational and reassuring, but the identity of the medium remained a secret. Stewart's readers were intrigued by this unexpected development in the life of a favorite writer. The books were successful enough to convince Dutton to publish more. The 9-year gap before the release of the Betty book includes most of the Great Depression. It's possible Stewart didn't feel comfortable sharing advice with his suffering readers from his privileged position of wealth. Several of his books were made into films and TV programs during those years. 1937, The Betty Book. Excursions into the world of other consciousness made by Betty between 1919 and 1936, recorded by Stewart Edward White. The Betty Book became a classic and a bestseller as Stewart reported from his deep dive into the world of mediumship and revealed that his medium was in fact his own dear wife Betty, a sensational revelation to the many fans of this legendary writer of westerns and frontier stories. 1939, Across the Unknown. A greater shock was in store for readers. The end of this bestseller told the story of the end of Betty's life. What Stewart reported proved meaningful to many at the beginning of World War II. Communication from beyond, not with words, but with an overwhelming warmth of affection, a thousand-fold amplification of the unmistakable, familiar presence of a loved one. Like Stewart, his readers thought this must be the grand finale, but far from it. 1940, The Unobstructed Universe. Yet another shock for readers as Betty returned to communicate with such accuracy. Stewart worried that the medium might remember the embarrassing parts. His eyewitness account became one of the most important documents of spiritual communication. This book was his biggest bestseller, and of course, their biggest bestseller. 1942, The Road I Know. 1943, Anchors to Windward. 1946, The Stars Are Still There. Stewart would refine and summarize the teachings throughout the war. He also shared communications from the invisibles he hadn't shared before. The content became, unsurprisingly, increasingly concerned with the fates of the many soldiers crossing over, a problem, Betty admitted, for the other side, where enough guides had to be found for them all. But being a guide requires training and experience. 1947, With Folded Wings. In what Stewart knew would be his last words for his readers, he shared what he had learned about life and death, about aging, and about human nature, with all the rueful realism of experience counterbalanced by not only his optimism, but the stability of his experience and understanding of the unobstructed. He hoped to help his and future generations face the challenges of a rapidly changing world. 1948, The Job of Living, a collection of readings that were Stewart's own contribution to receiving messages as he was able to communicate with Betty and the Invisibles, including Gaelic. Gaelic's channeled material was first circulated in mimeographed copies called the Gaelic manuscripts, then in the posthumously published book, The Job of Living. The advice is practical, encouraging creativity and attention to natural rhythms. This is the only book channeled by Stewart himself. Now, let's take a deeper look into the Betty book and the books that followed. The Betty book. Quote, in answer to the desperate need of a stricken world, this book offers a new pattern for individual and social living, based on recapture of faith, not in the, quote, there-ness, unquote, of immortality, but in its, quote, here-ness, unquote. This was only one of the bold statements contained in the Betty book. Excursions into the world of other consciousness made by Betty between 1919 and 1936. In 1936, the Whites, with some prodding from friends on this and the other side, decided to reveal that their philosophy came from channeling, but they wanted to retain some anonymity. So while Stewart admitted to his readers that his wisdom was from an unexpected source, he did not reveal that Betty, the medium, was his wife, Elizabeth. The risky move paid off when the Betty book was published in 1937 and became a classic of spiritualist literature. My own copy of the Betty book, bought on eBay for about $3, is a 1973 psychedelic paperback reprint by Berkeley Medallion, who specialized in filling airport gift shop and hotel pulp racks in mid-20th century America. The title, The Betty Book, is at the top in smaller font than the subtitle, Excursions into the World of Other Consciousness, followed by the quaint statement, recorded and vouched for by Stewart Edward White, end quote. The Betty book begins by explaining that history is a process of de-occultization. We take for granted the wonders of electricity, for example, that would have seemed like magical powers to our ancestors. The book ends with an experiment during which an invisible created what she called masks, so that Betty's face seemed to change to that of a child, and then to an exaggerated caricature, both seen by everyone present. Stewart wondered if it could have been a mass hallucination. Betty thought she was a medium because she had an especially sensitive nervous system. She wondered if human beings might evolve more sensitive nervous systems so that in the far future, communication with the invisibles could be a natural experience as common as a chat with a neighbor. She had given up pencil and paper for voice mediumship, sometimes speaking in her own voice, other times her voice changed. Her tone, choice of words, and personality became recognizably different. Less frequently, the voice did not come from Betty, but from somewhere near her. Eerie presentiments appeared in the Betty book, hidden meanings that would become starkly clear later. Quote, Betty was to be fitted for an introduction into the realities of another consciousness, that of these invisible intelligences. She was to go to them instead of their coming to her. It was described as a, quote, lessening of density, end quote, and a, quote, change of specific gravity, end quote. The Betty book also includes this advice from the Invisibles about how to live. Welcome and accept all natural human instincts, all the savoring of life, but permeate them with the vitality of the spirit. Those who savor even the highest forms of life, without this permeation of the spirit, stagnate, sink backward, imprison themselves in matter. With them, the spiritual sense becomes atrophied, end quote. Across the Unknown. Stewart and Betty's next book, Across the Unknown, A Formula for Living, was finished, or so they thought. In Across the Unknown, the Invisibles taught Betty how to cross over while still alive. Led step by the Invisibles to a state of consciousness available to everyone, but barely used by anyone, she reported on the after-death state. Betty described being reduced to a single point of consciousness. That essential atom of herself couldn't be pinned down in space-time. From this perspective, she seemed to be everywhere at once, yet nowhere. Her birth there was not unlike birth here. She began helpless, her surroundings unclear, wanting simple things, the way an infant needs nourishment and warmth. With various exercises, questions, and explanations, the Invisibles helped Betty experience greater awareness and control of her expanded consciousness. She also developed a new perspective of life on Earth. Quote, how could you tell anybody that all those things we do and putter with and play with are only the shadow of what we are actually creating in this great strength we do not see? They are experimental samples of life we look over and play with for selective purposes. Ordinarily, they are the only reality we recognize, but from here, they seem just shadows, end quote. Betty and the Invisibles give advice about better living. The lower self, subject to faults like irritability, gluttony, destructive thoughts, should not be treated as evil or an enemy. We are advised to think of a tennis match or other sport, a friendly game, rather than a mortal battle. How significant that Stewart gave the name The Blazed Trail to one of the chapters. Most of the chapter titles are frontier-related: border country, pioneer methods, homestead. Stewart wanted to make clear that the exploration of the borderline between life and death was the natural extension of human ambition. Now that the American West was settled and space was still out of reach at the time, only one unknown frontier remained. But before the book went to press, Betty became ill. She suffered 2 months before passing away. Publication of Across the Unknown was delayed. Stewart added an afterword titled, I Bear Witness, an extraordinary testimony of love. Stewart explained that the Invisibles had recently announced that the work would now take a new approach. They admitted it might not be comfortable, but it was the only way to achieve the full blossom of the great experiment. Stewart had no clue what they were talking about. He thought this would be a new level of the usual method of instruction. 2 weeks later, Betty suffered terrible pain. The doctors diagnosed a serious illness. Stewart now believed that curing Betty must be the new level. He believed their loyal readers would be disillusioned if they could not accomplish her healing. He admits they dreaded separation. They had been married 35 years. They had been apart only 3 times. Twice when he explored uncharted Africa, and once when he served during World War I. He describes the adventures they had. Quote, years of pack horse travel in the Rockies and Sierra, the cattle ranges of Arizona before the movies came, 14 months in Africa, 16 seasons in Alaska, here, there, and everywhere in the wild and tame corners of the earth. And adventures also among people and ideas, and for 20 years, the pioneering in these strange, dim regions of the higher consciousness, end quote. They had arrived at an understanding that there is no, quote, permanent separation, unquote, but that had never alleviated his dread of being apart from her, of suffering a dismal existence in the emptiness left by her absence. He admits that she, having traveled between this obstructed world and the unobstructed that awaits us all, faced her departure with assured serenity. She fought to live on, but she did it for him. He records this heartbreaking conversation with regret that he had not yet realized his selfishness was hurting her. Quote, I could go so easily, end quote, she told me. Quote, at any minute, I have to fight against it in the night, end quote. She asked me a little wistfully, quote, if it came about that way, you wouldn't mind too much letting me go, would you? End quote. And I, in my ignorance, replied emphatically, I most certainly would, end quote. 2 months of terrible pain left Betty weak, thin, and worn out. The woman who had eloquently reported her experiences in the unobstructed universe could now only whisper single words, gathering strength between each. One night when the doctor entered her room, she managed to smile, but seemed to slip back into unconsciousness. Stewart left the room and took a seat in his easy chair. It dawned on him that no mission of the Invisibles could be worth her suffering. He projected his thoughts toward her, explaining that if she knew it was time to leave, she should. Quote, I release you gladly, end quote, he said. The doctor entered a minute or two later. It was over, but the doctor looked confused as he explained that Betty had inexplicably spoken up, as clear and buoyant as she had always been, to declare, quote, it's all right. I've had a talk with my boy. You can take me now, end quote. Stewart reports relief that she would suffer no more pain. He's surprised the death, which had loomed with such horrifying density and terror, left in its wake a peaceful acceptance as well as grief. Quote, this next is very difficult to convey, end quote, Stewart wrote. He asks us to remember, quote, the cozy, intimate feeling of companionship you get sometimes when you are in the same room, perhaps each reading a book, not speaking, not even looking at one another. It is tenuous, an evanescent thing, one that we too often fail to savor and appreciate. Sometimes, in fact, it takes an evening or two of empty solitude to make us realize how substantial and important it really is, end quote. He reminds us of the bond of intimacy created by our mutual habits, our travels together, by our conversations, and the most intimate moments of married couples. He points out that all of these contacts are aimed at, quote, that rare inner feeling of companionship suggested feebly in the sitting by the fire idea, end quote. It's the only way we overcome the obstruction caused by, quote, the barriers of encasement in the body, end quote. Stewart explains what happened next. Well, this is him. Within a very few minutes, that companionship flooded through my whole being from Betty, but in an intensity and purity of which I had previously had no conception. It was the same thing, but 100, 1,000 times stronger. And I realized that it more than compensated for the little fact that she had stepped across, because it was the thing that all our physical activities together had striven for, but compared with this, had gained only dimly and in part. Does this sound fantastic? Maybe, but it is as real and solid as the chair I am sitting on. So much so that I've never in my life been so filled with pure happiness. No despair, no devastation, just a deeper happiness than I've experienced with her ever before, save in the brief moments when everything harmonized in fulfillment. And furthermore, it has lasted and is with me always, end quote. Stewart believed that this was the new level the Invisibles promised. He had received proof of Betty's survival that quieted any lingering doubts. He would have to write about it for their readers. He warns his readers that Betty's teachings may not help all of them reach such a tranquil point of view when suffering loss, but he believed that the trail Betty blazed proved that someday all human beings would know this communication between the obstructed and the unobstructed. We can only imagine the impact of that testimony on readers who had read Stewart for decades. So ends the book, but not the story, because the blossom Betty and the Invisibles had in mind was much more than Stewart bearing witness in an afterword. The great experiment continued. Across the Unknown first appeared on bookstore shelves in August 1939. The first day of September, the Nazi blitzkrieg overran Poland, starting World War II. And so ends part 2 of The Unobstructed Way. Part 3 will conclude our look at the lives and legacies of Betty and Stewart, including an exploration of Jung's experiences with mediums and his private opinion of Betty, which, as we have seen, was that she had proven herself a spirit, not merely an anima or an archetype. And in part 4, we will begin an in-depth 6-part look at the actual teachings and reports from the other side about the nature of the unobstructed, the meaning of life, the destiny of pets, and all sorts of amazing things in the books that the Whites provided us with. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed this, please comment or give a thumbs up or subscribe so that we know that you want more. And we hope that you find this inspiring and helpful. Thanks for spending time with us.